Chapter 26. Jack dumps all of the resources into the ocean. Jack stood in the middle of the little village's center, knee-deep in snow. People were milling around in the early morning, not deterred by the darkness, because the sun had yet to rise and probably wouldn't for quite some time still, but some seemed a little bit puzzled about the gangly guy picking up snow and peering at it for no obvious reason. Hiccup watched as Jack's hand traced absently up and down the frosty brand on his cheek and turned his frown to the sky.
"What's he doing?"
he asked quietly. Jamie shrugged.
"I don't know, like half the time,"
he admitted.
"What did Eden and Rune say?" "It started snowing sometime after we'd gone to bed last night. It's been like this for hours already."
Jack turned to them. Hiccup thought they'd been speaking quietly, but it seemed not so when Jack headed towards them. Eden and Rune's front door was closed, and Hiccup could guess that the couple was just inside, probably discussing the trio's weird behavior. He tried desperately to come up with an explanation for why Jamie had bolted at the sight of snow, and why Hiccup and Jack had come running back down with him. Toothless a little further behind, as he had some trouble squeezing through the trapdoor. But he seemed out of stock for explanations like that, and Hiccup was beginning to resign himself to that fact. Whatever conclusion Eden and Rune came to, they'd just have to stick with that.
"Nothing,"
Jack said as he came up to them. "I don't feel anything." Jamie smiled weakly.
"That's a good thing, right?"
"Yeah," Jack said, returning the smile in the same fashion. "Probably. Unless—" Hiccup knew there was an unless coming. "She wanted me to know she was coming the last time, and that was the only reason I could feel her presence. And if I let myself believe I'm one step ahead of her, she'll catch us off guard." Jack traced the mark again, looking around uneasily. "Either way, we should go."
"Where to?"
Hiccup asked. "You know the archipelago," Jack said. "Just anywhere. Away. Further south. Away from Burke. Anywhere you think might have traces." Hiccup looked away from Jack's eyes at the last part, shaking his head.
"I don't know anything about that," he said, "but away from Burke sounds good. Further south."
He trailed off, trying to imagine his map in his head. He scratched his chin.
"I don't know much about that side of the archipelago. We could be heading towards the end of the world for all I know."
Jack looked amused. "I'm sure it's not that drastic," he said, and nodded towards Eden and Rune's front door. "Let's pack up." While Jack and Jamie went upstairs to gather their belongings, Hiccup unrolled the map on one of the many tables. Rune smirked at him from where he sat, still with his breakfast. "No trouble, eh?" he asked.
"Definitely not,"
Hiccup replied, with no effort to make it sound convincing. Rune hummed but didn't say anything more. He got to his feet and headed upstairs as well. Eden walked over to him, looking at the map.
"Gods,"
she muttered.
"Makes me feel pretty guilty for staying cooped up at home so much. You've been to all these places?"
Hiccup knew she was leading up to something else entirely.
"Yeah,"
he replied, looking at her with a question in his expression. Eden met his eyes.
"I'd be worried about bringing trouble back home," she said. "But you must have that under control, right?"
"Oh," Hiccup said, and couldn't help but hesitate.
"Oh,"
Eden replied with a small smile.
"I see. I wouldn't worry too much. This house has seen the worst already."
Hiccup seriously doubted that, but he smiled stiffly in response.
"We'll get out of here,"
he told her, because that was the only thing he could promise. He looked back down at the map, at the islands dwindling towards the south. They hadn't explored much of those parts. It was a gamble to fly that way, and yet it was better than to travel up north and face any hissy winter spirits. Unless they could find a way to defeat her. Jack had said no, but Hiccup had faced odds that were deemed impossible before. At the same time, Hiccup would only remain undefeated until he was defeated. He stroked his chin as the gears in his mind turned. Going south seemed dangerous, but maybe the fairy would notice if they were flying in the direction of something magical. Maybe even Hiccup would notice, though that thought still made his stomach twist. Despite knowing that there was no way he'd let Jack and Jamie deal with this on their own, he still didn't know if he wanted to be a part of this whole magic thing. Eden and Rune were two people who were very much used to sketchy people coming into their home, so they were good at keeping the questions to themselves. All they wondered was if they now had a reason to be a little extra wary, to which Hiccup vaguely replied that constant vigilance was never a bad thing, especially now that devastating winter was approaching. Then he realized that devastating winter wasn't a thing around these parts, but if the Snowkin really was as furious as Jack described, then it might just become a thing soon. Idun gave them a bag of food and, while Rune wasn't watching, a water skin of what definitely did not contain water. A few minutes later, they were back on Toothless, heading south. When the island was turning into a dot in the distance, Hiccup turned around to look at Jack.
"How's your face?"
"Pale and a little gaunt," Jack admitted.
Hiccup feigned exasperation. "And the mark?"
Jack pursed his lips, probably disappointed that Hiccup hadn't been distracted by his joke. "It's the same," he said. "It doesn't hurt, but—" Hiccup nodded, turning ahead again.
"We should stay alert,"
he finished for him. They kept heading towards the dark, empty horizon. It was scarier than when they'd been flying to eventually find Outpost Island. At least they had a map to follow back then. They knew they'd get to land at some point, but Hiccup reminded himself that Vikings before him had gone on voyages just as, or maybe more, dangerous than this one. It still didn't stop him from sending a soundless prayer to the gods that they weren't heading straight for the edge of the world.
"The archipelago has lots of small, undiscovered islands,"
he reassured himself. They'd find one of them in time. Conversation died and came back to life in a steady cycle. Hiccup kept Jack and Jamie, and the fairy, he realized upon catching a curious eyes peeking up from Jamie's vest, entertained by teaching them facts about dragons and how he and the gang had come to know those facts. They'd been flying for a good 3 hours, and Hiccup had started to lose feeling in his toes when Jack suddenly placed a freezing hand in the crook of his neck. Hiccup cringed away from his touch.
"Very funny," he started.
"I think we should speed up," Jack said in a flat voice. A shiver, not caused by the cold, went down Hiccup's spine. He turned around to face him.
"Is something wrong?"
"I'm not sure, but—" Jack interrupted himself with a wince, his hand coming up to the Snow Queen's mark. His eyes went wide. "We have to go. We have to hurry." Toothless growled, and though he sped up a little bit, Hiccup could hear the accusation in his tone. He was carrying a lot of weight, so if they were attacked in the air— Hiccup shouldn't have let the thought cross his mind. He hoped it was only the whistling of the wind making the noise that followed, a distant, high-pitched screech making the hair on Hiccup's neck stand up.
"A dragon?"
Jamie asked.
"I don't think so,"
Hiccup reluctantly replied. Jamie looked around.
"An eagle, maybe?"
he suggested. The sun had yet to rise, and below them was only the dark ocean. Hiccup couldn't see anything but the faint glow on the horizon coming from the moon high above.
"Let's go up,"
he muttered, and Toothless made for the clouds. It couldn't snow if there weren't any clouds to form snow, right? Faintly, he could hear Jack's breathing behind him. It sounded like he was trying not to hyperventilate, and his hand shook slightly where they still held onto Hiccup's shoulder. Was he still in pain? They broke the cloud layer, and the moon shone down on them. The clouds were scrambled around them in grayscale, almost tunneling towards the horizon. It was colder up here, but the stars were bright overhead, if not slightly fainter now that the night was about to give way to day. Aside from the wind and the beating of Toothless's wings, everything was eerie and silent. Nothing happened for a minute or so. Hiccup almost started to hope that Jack's pain had only been a sudden headache, or maybe even just paranoia, but that theory was promptly debunked when another one of those cries pierced the air. Jamie was right. From the ocean of gray burst 3 eagles, sparkling white, as if they'd been molded right out of the clouds. They were huge, bigger than any eagle Hiccup had ever seen, so big they could rival Toothless, and if the color scheme wasn't weird enough, they seemed to be leaving some sort of dust in their wake. Was that snowflakes? It didn't matter. The eagles were heading straight for them. Hiccup gritted his teeth. He leaned forward and clutched the handle, simultaneously making sure Jamie wouldn't fall off.
"Hold on tight,"
he ordered, and then Toothless shot forward, dodging the eagles. Jack latched onto Hiccup, with one arm since he was still stupidly holding onto his staff. Hiccup knew it was important to him, but was it really worth risking his life for it? The eagles shrieked indignantly as they flashed past them, but from the clouds burst even more of them. Hiccup glanced behind himself and saw that the eagles they dodged were quickly closing in on them again.
"Why are they attacking us?"
Hiccup bellowed.
"What do you think?"
Jack yelled back.
"They're from her. She has eagles now. Soldiers? What doesn't she have?"
Hiccup swore when another eagle rose from the clouds, barely avoiding a collision. The eagle had its claws out for them, and one of them brushed past Hiccup's cheek. Pain flared in his face.
"They're made out of snow,"
Jack said.
"Are you— Hiccup, you're bleeding." "Toothless!"
Hiccup yelled and flattened himself and Jamie against the saddle.
"Jack, hold on."
Toothless turned in the air, and just before crashing into an eagle coming straight for them, there was a high-pitched noise, and a plasma blast tore the bird, ice sculpture, to shreds. Hiccup tried not to feel bad about it. And then he saw just how many eagles were left, and promptly forgot about his guilt. He didn't have the time to count how many, but it was sufficient to say that they were ridiculously outnumbered. Around 10, he estimated hopefully. Maybe more. Probably more. "Up!" Jamie shrieked. Hiccup didn't know if he meant fly up or there's an evil eagle above us and about to tear our eyes out, but he got the answer when he got whipped by a face full of icy feathers. Jack gave out a choked cry, and Hiccup surprised himself with his own speed when he whirled around and grabbed onto Jack's staff. The eagle had attempted to snatch Jack, but admitted defeat when Hiccup smashed the staff into its glittering beak. It spun off course. Hiccup steadied Jack, then pushed the staff back into his hands. Instead, he pulled out Inferno. Toothless was flying away as fast as he could, which should have been enough, even with all the extra weight. No bird could outfly a Night Fury, and yet these abominations seemed to be the exception. 3 passengers, as well as everything Hiccup had packed to help them on their journey, were just enough to put their chances at odds. He groaned in frustration. "Jack, get rid of the bags," he said, igniting Inferno. Toothless blasted another couple of eagles. It was a good effort, but a desperate one. There were too many of them. In this narrow window of eagle-free air, Hiccup took off a security harness and fastened it onto Jamie instead. As long as Hiccup remembered that he wasn't attached himself, he should be fine. Jack abruptly pushed him forward. An eagle shrieked as it passed right above them. "They're trying to grab me," Jack yelled. "The Snow Queen! She's trying to stop me from leaving her territory!" He yelped when Hiccup swung his sword over his head. It sliced into an eagle and made a brief, sizzling sound. The bird only shrieked, falling back a few paces, but didn't seem too bothered by the flaming blade. "She's not taking you anywhere," Hiccup promised. "The bags, Jack!" Jack put his staff in the crook of his arm and held onto Hiccup as he started untying the bags. As Toothless flew in a wide arch to get some distance between himself and the eagles, the bags fell one by one into the clouds and disappeared. He was about to push off the bag containing Edon and Rune's gift when Toothless had to dive to avoid another set of claws, and Jack yelped again, his grip on Hiccup tightening like he'd lost his balance. Out of nowhere, an eagle passed over them from the right and hooked his claws into Jack's cloak. This time, it happened too fast. "Jack!" Jamie shrieked as the eagle flew away with a thrashing Jack in its claws. Hiccup didn't need to tell Toothless to turn around. They shot after the eagles, who now seemed to lose interest in the rest of them since they'd attained what they were looking for. They turned away in unison, as if they were sharing one mind. Toothless sped after them, a little nimbler now that the bags didn't impair him. In the back of Hiccup's mind, he mourned the loss of his favorite blanket, but that was the least of his problems right now. Despite everything, Hiccup was glad the eagle wasn't deterred by Jack's violent thrashing and whacking of his staff, because if it had dropped him, Hiccup didn't know if they would be fast enough to catch him. They had to get close first. "Hold on tight, Jamie," he said, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. "Take out as many as you can, Toothless." "Wait, he might hit Jack," Jamie protested. Toothless didn't wait. He fired 5 times. 4 of them hit before the eagles realized they were being followed and moved swiftly out of the way. Jamie let out a thin sound. "A Night Fury never misses," Hiccup told him, still having it in him to feel smug despite the urgency of the situation. Toothless roared, apparently sharing the enthusiasm. Then the eagles came at them, and Hiccup held onto the saddle for dear life as Toothless had to dodge and turn in every direction to avoid their sharp beaks and claws. Jamie kept yelling where the eagles were coming from, and whether or not it was actually helpful, Hiccup was still impressed that he wasn't just screaming in panic, as this had to be the first time he'd experienced an airborne battle. He was either extremely brave or extremely trusting that Hiccup and Toothless knew what they were doing. If it was the latter option, then that impression was probably shattered when the remaining eagles, about 5 of them now, started swarming them, grabbing for Hiccup like they had for Jack. Hiccup got the impossible idea that they somehow knew what would happen if he and Toothless were separated. But that couldn't be, right? They were just birds, not intelligent enough to figure out that Hiccup was in control of Toothless's tail fin, no matter how much they moved as if they were being controlled by a single mind. Hiccup huffed a sigh. That was exactly what was going on, wasn't it? He switched between clutching the handle and slashing out with Inferno in a feeble attempt to chase the birds off, but there were still too many, and they were blocking Toothless's path and driving him off course. Jack was quickly disappearing into the darkness. If they didn't hurry, Toothless might not be able to follow his scent. And then things got worse. Toothless swerved suddenly in the air when an eagle had its claws out for his eyes, just when Hiccup slashed at another eagle swooping in after Jamie. For a moment too long, Hiccup forgot that he'd unlatched himself, which, in retrospect, was silly. If Jamie had fallen, Toothless would still have had a chance to catch him. But Hiccup was the one falling, which meant all three of them were falling. An eagle grabbed a hold of him just to toss him away, sending him spinning through the air away from Toothless and Jamie. The latter two gave matching distressed cries, and then Hiccup was engulfed in the grey clouds. Hiccup couldn't do much but yell for Toothless, hoping that he'd somehow be able to catch up with him. The ocean came into view, thundering towards him. He couldn't see Toothless anywhere, but he also couldn't steady himself enough in the air to get a proper look around. He saw the grey clouds above and the black ocean below, interchanging on a slightly gentler pace as Hiccup flailed to regain his balance. He stared up at the clouds, waiting, and then he realized, with a frighteningly clear understanding, that this would be it. No epic battle, no heartfelt sacrifice, no happy ending. He'd die falling from the sky, and none of his friends and family back on Berg would even know. Toothless and Jamie might get a softer landing, but they wouldn't be able to stay above the freezing water for long, if the eagles didn't take care of them before that. And Jack was in the hands of the Snow Queen, just like Hiccup had said wouldn't happen. But no, he'd had too many near-death experiences to truly believe that things could end in such a way. And just as the thought came to him, a miracle unfolded before his eyes. Toothless dived nose first out of the clouds, his course too steady and controlled for him to be flying on his own. Jamie still sat on his back, clutching the handle, his leg outstretched to reach the gears in the saddle. Hiccup let out a hysteric laugh. Only moments before hitting the water, Toothless caught him in his claws. As they arched upwards, the water below Hiccup shifted, and he glimpsed what he registered as scales and a couple of eyes peeking up at them from beneath the surface. Then they were rising again, and Jamie called out his name. Hiccup put Inferno away and climbed onto the saddle.
"Jamie, out and speared,"
he panted as he came up. "Jack!" Jamie barked at him, sliding forward on the saddle to give Hiccup control again. He was right. Questions about this impossible feat could come after they'd retrieved Jack from the evil eagles. An idea was forming in Hiccup's head. Toothless sped after Jack, and for a few dreadful seconds, Hiccup thought they'd lost him. But as they flew through the clouds and the sky came back into view, he saw them. The eagles didn't seem to know they were being followed, which only strengthened Hiccup's belief that they were being controlled by the Snow Queen. The three of them flew in silence, hoping to sneak up on the eagles. Toothless kept low in the clouds, and for once Hiccup was thankful for the remaining night.
"Take out the one holding Jack,"
Hiccup said softly, knowing that Toothless would hear him.
"I don't think we'll get another chance."
Jack's voice echoed through the air, but Hiccup couldn't discern any words. Either he was calling for help, or he was cursing the Snow Queen, possibly in his native language, and possibly with a few colorful words that shouldn't make it to Jamie's ears. They were close below them now.
"Now!"
Hiccup hissed. Light emitted from Toothless's open mouth, and the high-pitched noise preceding the blast mixed with the wind. The eagle holding Jack didn't even get the chance to screech before it was torn apart. Jack did the screaming instead, as did the remaining eagles. They dove after Jack, the eagles close behind. For a moment, Toothless and Jack were falling side by side. Jack's face lit up.
"Ruthless!"
He cheered before Toothless grabbed him.
"Keep diving!"
Hiccup yelled.
"What?"
Jamie yelled back.
"Hold on, Jack!"
He leaned sideways, managing to catch Jack's wide eyes. He cracked an adrenaline-induced grin.
"I have a plan."
Jack stared at him before his eyes flickered to the eagles behind them. He shook his head helplessly.
"Okay, I hope you really are as smart as people say you are."
Hiccup didn't know if he should take that as a compliment or not. He straightened up and leaned forward again.
"You okay, Jamie?"
he asked as they plunged towards the ocean.
"Yep,"
Jamie squeaked.
"The Squadron, Toothless,"
Hiccup called and set his jaw as he closed in on the spot where he'd seen the curious gazes beneath the waves.
"Agitated, but don't hurt it. Make it attack us."
Jamie sent him a sharp look, but kept his mouth shut. Hiccup definitely didn't deserve that level of trust. The eagles were closing in behind them. They had little time, and Hiccup could only hope that his plan would pay off. The Squadron peeked up from the water, its long neck glistening in the faint light from the sky. Toothless shot at it, the blast colliding against the waves around it. It was a close call, and the Squadron crouched defensively. Hiccup prepared to change gears.
"When I say swerve,"
he said as the Squadron prepared to attack. Behind them, the eagles shrieked, sounding just barely out of reach. The Squadron attacked.
"Swerve!"
Toothless cut to the right, and the Squadron's boiling water washed over the icy eagles. The eagles shrieked until the haunting voices faded, and Toothless shot back up into the sky. The eagles didn't follow, and when Hiccup looked back, they were nowhere to be found.
They melted," Jamie muttered incredulously. "They were made of snow like—"
Hiccup closed his eyes, letting relief wash over him. Then he leaned sideways.
Still alive, Jack? He called.
Jack looked up, his jaw slack. When he met Hiccup's eyes, his face broke into an eye-crinkling grin.
You really are crazy,
he laughed. His laugh was infectious. Hiccup couldn't help but join in.
Look,
Jamie then said, pointing ahead. Barely visible against the grey horizon, an island rose from the sea. Hiccup couldn't believe the luck. Which was why he was 100% prepared to meet something unpleasant once they got there. Jack's shoulder hurt too much to pull him into the saddle, but he reassured them that he was fine just hanging from Toothless's paws until they got to the island. In fact, he sounded like he was enjoying himself, and Hiccup wrote it off as lingering hysteria. Jamie also had it. He was all but vibrating in his seat, giggling to himself and also glancing behind them every now and then, on the lookout for any more eagles. Once they got to the island, Toothless dropped Jack smoothly onto the coarse grey beach before landing himself. Jamie got off the saddle and ran over to Jack. Hiccup checked on Toothless, who was unharmed, before following. The fairy was sitting on Jack's shoulder, looking just as exhausted as Jack himself. Hiccup hadn't even thought about her during the attack, but he could only assume she'd tried fighting them off in any way she could as well. What that way was, he didn't know, and probably didn't want to.
Everyone all right?
Asked Hiccup. Jamie laughed suddenly, then just as suddenly shut his mouth. Jack looked at him, his expression brightening as well. He nodded.
Your cheek,
he said.
Your shoulder,
Hiccup countered. He looked at Jamie, at first to check for injuries, but when their eyes met, there was a sort of tension in the air. Jamie pressed his lips shut, as if he was expecting to be scolded. Hiccup shook his head, and an airy chuckle escaped him.
What on earth happened just now?
Confusion made its way onto Jack's face as his eyes started between the two of them. Jamie shifted his weight, smiling slowly.
Well, you wouldn't teach me how to ride a dragon, so I thought that the least I could do is learn the theory, you know?
He started, before taking a deep breath.
I tried learning through a dragon I called Squawk as well, but it didn't really do any good because it was lazy and wouldn't be able to carry anyone anyway, so I just studied your notes and your drawings, and I learned the runes and stuff so that I could at least understand how the gears work on the saddle, and then I just observed what you did while you were flying, and, I'm not sure I did it right, but...
The last words were delivered with subdued embarrassment, despite the sheer awe and disbelief that Hiccup was feeling.
What?
Jack summed up. Something akin to realization was dawning on his face, the flitting of his eyes more rapid than before. He looked at Jamie like he'd just risen from the dead.
Hold on, what are you saying right now? What happened?
Jamie looked at Hiccup again, and Hiccup couldn't do anything but grin.
You tell him,
he said, sitting down on the sand, mostly because his legs felt like limpets, but also to give Jamie the spotlight. And Jamie jumped to the opportunity. Hiccup envied his energy as he relayed what had happened, while Jack was in the eagle's clutches. To Hiccup's embarrassment, but also a bit of smug gratitude, he started the story with descriptions of how cool he and Toothless had been as they fought and dodged the eagles, before going on to talk about the real highlight of the story. Jack's expression went slack.
I wasn't even thinking. I just moved, like I just knew I had to do something, and then it worked, and Toothless just dived, and I thought that I'd do something wrong any second, but then we caught him, and I changed the position, and we soared up again, and it was incredible, Jack. I rode a dragon. I rode Toothless.
Toothless had joined in on the presentation somewhere in the middle, and playfully shoved Jamie upon hearing his name. Jamie's laugh was still a bit hysterical, and Hiccup had to strain himself not to burst out laughing too. It was just so unbelievable, he almost expected Jack to accuse them of lying. Jack's mouth was hanging open, but it was clear he believed every word that was being said. A grin was making its way onto his face. I don't even know why I'm surprised, he said.
And then,
Jamie continued, bouncing over to Hiccup to grab his shoulder,
we caught up to you, and he was like, we have to take out the one holding Jack first. I don't sound like that,
Hiccup said, but Jamie didn't seem to hear him.
And I said, but you're going to hit Jack. Or was that before? Anyway, and Hiccup was like, and Night Fury never misses. And then Toothless didn't miss. And then, well, you know what happened from then on.
Jamie laughed sheepishly and plopped down onto the sand in front of them, sitting still only for a moment before leaping at Jack to hug him. Jack made a surprised noise, but hugged him back after a second. He shared a look with Hiccup, then sighed and pressed his nose into Jamie's hair. You did amazing, Jamie, he told him. Jamie leaned back with a quivering breath, and Hiccup realized the adrenaline must be leaving him. His hands were shaking.
It was pretty scary, too,
he admitted with a feeble laugh. Hiccup's heart sank at that. He reached over and patted Jamie's shoulder.
It gets less scary with practice,
he told him. Jamie's eyes widened.
You mean, can we... Are you saying you want to teach me now? He stammered. Only if you want to, Hiccup said, glancing at Jack for confirmation. Jack's eyes only sparkled with anticipation. Hiccup hadn't expected him to protest. Then he yelped as Jamie lunged at him as well, hugging him tightly. He barely collected himself in time to awkwardly return the hug before Jamie pulled back with a huge grin. When do we start? He asked. Now? Hiccup laughed. Soon, I think, he said, and looked around. The beach faded into a field of yellow grass, and then to a forest with tall, mostly bare trees. It looked somehow less threatening than the last forest they'd been in, which might have just been because it was dawn now, but Hiccup tried to believe it was because they were heading away from danger. Rocky hills rose towards the west, and he pointed at them. We should find a place to rest up first, and then we should look for water and supplies. Now that... He didn't bother finishing the sentence. They all looked at the remaining bags tied to Toothless's saddle. Rune and Edun's gift, and the satchel in which Hiccup kept his spare legs. Maybe we'll come across another marketplace sometime, Jack suggested hopefully. Doesn't do as much good without any silver or anything to trade, Hiccup mumbled before shaking his head. But we'll manage. First of all, let's head over to those hills. We can check out the island later, in case there's anything here we should watch out for. Jack and Jamie's tense expressions told him they were thinking about different things. Dragons, I mean, he quickly clarified. This island seems perfect for certain kinds of dragons. Ooh, Jamie whispered. Dangerous ones? Hiccup got to his feet and held out one hand for each of them. He smiled. Let's find out. While they were searching for shelter in the rocky hills, Jamie was aware that he kept retelling the story to Jack, just using slightly different words each time. But every time he kept forgetting to tell him certain details, like how his stomach had surged, and how the air had felt like a whip against his face, and how Toothless and Hiccup seemed to share one mind when it came to flying, and how his sword looked like a lightsaber. Jack didn't get that part, but he assured him it was really, really cool. Toothless eventually found a small cave where they sat down for a bit. Hiccup checked Jack's shoulder and looked surprised to see that the wound hadn't reopened in the kerfuffle. Jack also kept asking Jamie if he was sure he was all right, and didn't stop until they were out of the cave again and were making their way along the base of the hill, when Jamie showed him the blisters he'd gotten from clutching the handle of the saddle. That's all, he promised. Really. Jack carefully turned Jamie's hand over and laughingly shook his head. You're something else, Jamie, he told him, and Jamie felt himself blush at the pride in his voice. Well, you should have seen Hiccup, Jamie said, feeling suddenly bashful that he'd boasted so much about himself. I did see some of Hiccup, Jack said, sending Hiccup a lopsided grin. It was pretty cool. Hiccup glanced at his feet. We all did a good job, he said with a sheepish laugh. Jack pursed his lips and sent his staff a doubtful look. Jamie knew what he was thinking. He hadn't gotten much chance to do anything heroic, but that didn't matter, because he'd been heroic loads of other times. Do you want to learn how to fly, Jack? Hiccup asked. He wasn't looking at any of them. His eyes were scanning the area, looking for signs of life that Jamie was sure the rest of them would miss, even if they were right in front of them. Jack seemed thoughtful. He looked at Toothless, then up at the clouds. Maybe, he said, though it sounded half-hearted. It would at least put less weight on Toothless if we had more dragons to carry us. Could I get my own dragon? Jamie asked hopefully. I think you better get used to flying with Toothless first, Hiccup said. Jamie shrugged. That was fine by him. What kind of dragon will I ride then? Jack asked. It seems a sort of mutual bond between the dragon and the rider, doesn't it? Everyone seems to have something in common with a dragon. Hiccup glanced at Jack for a moment, then at Toothless. You're right, he said with a soft smile. I don't know. I guess it's just something that happens naturally. He hummed, falling into step with Jack as he studied him. Jack sent him a wary look. What? I'm just trying to guess what kind of dragon you would like, he said, considering you don't seem to be a big fan of fire. That's just because... Jack started, but cut himself off. He shook his head. Fire's fine. I mean, that's just something you'll have to deal with if you're going to be a dragon rider, isn't it? Hiccup hesitated for a moment before nodding. Mostly, yeah, he said. Still, I might have said a deadly nether, but they have one of the hottest types of fire. Deadly nether? Jack repeated. He peered at Hiccup. They seem a bit vain to me. They are a bit vain, Hiccup agreed. Jack raised a brow. Not that, you're vain, Hiccup said, waving his hands. That's not, their only features. They're loyal, too, and, well, let's see. Maybe a razor whip? He hesitated. though a bunch of them are aggressive towards males.
Jack snorted. What are you insinuating right now? Jamie decided to fall a little bit behind when Hiccup started stammering again. He didn't need to hear him flounder for an explanation. If only he realized Jack was just messing with him. Thankfully, it didn't take long before Jack burst out laughing and the conversation stopped, causing Jamie so much second-hand embarrassment. As they kept walking, the topic turned to magic again, specifically tooth fairies. Hiccup seemed to have forgotten about scouting for dragons, his gaze focused very intently on Jack as the latter tried to convince him that Babytooth wasn't a criminal. "It's not burglary," he said, slowly as if he was talking to one of Berg's less sharp citizens. "They're doing their jobs."
"They take the teeth,"
Hiccup said. Jack moaned in exasperation, casting his eyes to the sky.
"Yes, they take the teeth, Hiccup,"
he said, missing the amused smile passing over Hiccup's face.
"That's the point. People want them to take the teeth, and then they leave gifts in exchange. It's a nice, exciting affair, I promise. Kids love it."
He looked pointedly at Hiccup. "There's nothing sinister about it, nothing creepy."
"I'd say that's up to the individual,"
Hiccup said, and grinned when Jack shoved at him. Jamie wondered why Jack was getting so worked up about this, though it didn't seem like he was annoyed in the way he sometimes got with the twins. This seemed more playful, but still with a touch of frustration, or maybe more than a touch.
"I'd say making necklaces of your kids' baby teeth is a lot creepier," Jack countered. "At least we don't pretend otherwise,"
Hiccup said with a shrug. Jack dragged a hand over his face.
"Oh, come on."
He gestured at Babytooth, who was flying ahead, seemingly unaware that she was being talked about.
"I'm not going to believe that someone who just fought a bunch of giant, magic, ice eagles on Dragonback, hundreds of meters up in the sky, is afraid of her."
Hiccup followed his gaze.
"If she appeared in my room in the middle of the night, I would be,"
he replied after a moment of contemplation.
"You wouldn't know. You'd be asleep. That's the whole point."
"Oh, much better. Fairies watching me sleep. No, thank you."
"Hiccup, I am very happy to inform you," Jack said with a borderline sadistic grin, "that she's been watching you sleep for a long time already."
Hiccup frowned.
"Now that information is in my brain," he murmured.
He shrugged with his hands again, looking back at Jack.
"I'm just saying that the stories about magic we Burkians have grown up with aren't exactly warm and fuzzy. How do you—"
He cut himself off and glanced at Babytooth before leaning a little closer to Jack.
"How do you even know you can trust her?"
The corners of Jack's mouth pointed promptly downwards.
"What will it take you to make you believe that not all magic is bad?" he asked.
The conversation had turned slightly sour. Hiccup looked at the ground and shrugged yet again.
"When something good happens?"
he suggested. Jack stared at him, then let out a great sigh.
"Okay, I guess that's a fair point," he admitted, looking ahead.
Jamie couldn't see his expression, as he was still walking a little bit behind the two of them. For some reason, Jamie had begun finding it interesting to observe the way they acted around each other. Maybe it had something to do with knowing more about Jack's backstory now, and how it seemed he'd never really had a friend his own age while he was human. And then it might also have something to do with the skittish way Hiccup sometimes acted around Jack. It was weird, but Jamie guessed it related to the whole magic thing. Jack probably had good reason to want to keep Jack Frost hidden from him, at least for the time being, if Hiccup kept acting so uncomfortable with it all.
"I'll find a way to show you someday," Jack said.
He smiled at Hiccup, but it had a sadness to it. Hiccup looked like he was struggling to maintain eye contact again.
"Yeah," he murmured. I'll get used to it, Jack. Don't worry about it."
And now, Jamie suddenly felt as if he was watching something private. He decided to look away, focusing on the nature around them instead, and then something caught his eye. Among the withered green, something was emitting a faint glow. Jamie stopped in his tracks, staring at it.
Was it changing color?
He was walking into the bushes without a second thought, with the intention of checking whatever it was out, and then alert the others before they walked too far away. The glowing thing was lying close to the mountain wall, halfway covered by shrubbery. For a second, Jamie thought he'd found another crystal, though that wouldn't have fit into the theories they'd built around the crystals at this point. It did look like a stone, though, aside from the very glaring fact that it was glowing in different colors. Jamie picked it up. It was hard not to. Turning it over, he saw it had some sort of oval shape. It actually sort of looked like... There was a movement in the bushes to his right, but when he whipped around to see, there was nothing there. His heart started hammering in his chest. Maybe there was something magical about this thing after all. Maybe it triggered some sort of spell, or a curse more likely. judging by all the other magic they'd encountered. He turned around, deciding that he better show this to the others, but stopped again when the forest in front of him seemed to shimmer. He stepped back as 2 spots of yellow appeared midair. Eyes, he realized. A pair of huge, yellow, floating eyes. They were staring right at him. Red started to spread in the green of the foliage, the rest of the creature coming into view. Big, red and scaly, with a slender body, wings and sharp talons. Jamie couldn't get himself to move, and maybe that was for the best. In the back of his head, Hiccup's notes fluttered around until the right one settled behind his eyes. The dragon standing before him was a changewing, and Jamie was holding one of her eggs.